So, you know, it's pretty wild when you really think about it.
What specifically?
Well, all the different ways humans have tried to, like, get beyond just everyday experience, psychedelic journeys, ancient vision quests, these mystery cult initiations.
Different paths, maybe?
Yeah, maybe different paths, but all kind of aiming at seeing more, perceiving reality differently. You had that great analogy, didn't you, about our senses being like radio antennas.
Oh, yeah. The frequency bands idea.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Turned into specific channels, limiting what we pick up.
It's a useful way to think about it, I find, especially for what we're digging into today.
Which is what exactly lay out the mission.
Okay, so we've got some fascinating source material, excerpts looking at psychedelics, consciousness, ancient traditions.
Right.
And also a transcript talking about some really cutting-edge, almost sci-fi sounding stuff on quantum consciousness.
Quantum consciousness. Okay, wow.
Yeah. So the plan, the mission, is to explore all this and see where the overlaps are, look for common themes around altered perception, expanded consciousness, that sort of thing.
God, it sounds like a proper deep dive. Where should we start? Psychedelics.
Let's do it. That seems like a good entry point. The experiences themselves.
Okay, so your notes mention this whole spectrum, right? It's
Yeah.
not all the same thing.
Not at all. You've got, say, psilocybin or LSD, which can bring on visuals, definitely deep thoughts, personal insights. But you often still feel kind of grounded in the normal world.
Like things look different, feel different, but you're still here.
Exactly. Then you've got the really intense ones like DMT or maybe high-dose ayahuasca.
And that's where things get weirder.
That's where people report really detaching, leaving the body, feeling like they're in completely different dimensions, sometimes encountering entities, beings.
Whoa, okay. So encountering beings, we'll come back to that. But first, just the basic perception shifts. Synesthesia, seeing sounds.
Yeah, that's a classic example of senses kind of bleeding into each other, perceiving more in a very literal way, maybe. The boundaries just seem to dissolve.
And colors. The notes said psilocybin makes color seem oversaturated and dissolve the boundaries between objects.
Right. Everything can become incredibly vibrant. Patterns emerge everywhere. Even simple objects can suddenly lose their familiar meaning and feel, I don't know, alien or profound.
Huh. It sounds like it completely rewrites your sensory input.
You can feel that way. And beyond just the senses, there are these mystical type experiences people often report.
What does that mean exactly? Mystical type.
Well, researchers use that term. It usually involves these profound feelings of unity, like being connected to everything.
Oneness.
Yes, oneness. A sense of transcending time and space, overwhelmingly positive feelings, and this sense that the experience is ultimately impossible to describe in words.
Ineffable.
Precisely. And the clinical research, particularly with psilocybin, is actually showing links between these experiences and long-lasting positive changes in mood and outlook.
That's huge.
Yeah.
That it's not just a weird trip, but can actually be beneficial.
Potentially, yes. Which leads us back to those really intense experiences, the entity encounters.
Right, the beings.
Yeah.
DMT seems to be the big one for this.
Yeah.
Machine elves. Aliens?
Yeah, high-dose DMT is famous for it. Dr. Rick Strassman's research back in the 90s really highlighted this. He gave people DMT in a controlled setting.
Great.
And a significant number came back reporting these incredibly vivid interactions with beings that felt totally real, totally independent of them.
Not just hallucinations.
That's the fascinating part. The subjective sense is that they are absolutely real encounters. Strassman himself called DMT the spirit molecule and was apparently quite surprised by how common and convincing these reports were. People felt they were entering an external realm.
And these beings, did they interact?
Oh, yes. Sometimes offering guidance, sometimes information, sometimes just being there. Or even presenting challenges. It varies hugely.
Is it only DMT? Or do other psychedelics do this too?
Others can as well, yeah. The source mentioned ayahuasca, where the experience is often personified as Mother Ayahuasca, this guiding intelligence.
A plant spirit, kind of.
Sort of, yeah. Or animal spirits. With psilocybin, sometimes people talk about a mushroom spirit. LSD might be more fractal beings or a sense of cosmic consciousness.
So different flavors, but a similar theme.
Exactly. The common thread is this feeling of interacting with some kind of non-self intelligence. It's a really strange and consistent feature across different substances sometimes.
Okay. And then there are OBEs, out-of-body experiences.
Right. Also reported, particularly with DMT and ayahuasca, but sometimes LSD and psilocybin too, this distinct feeling of your awareness separating from your physical body.
Floating above yourself or something.
Sometimes, or just feeling like you've entered another dimension entirely, leaving the physical behind. Strassman even speculated, about whether endogenous DMT made in our own brains, could be released at death and linked to near-death experiences.
Wow. That's a big leap.
It's speculative, for sure, but it shows how these modern experiences connect back to these really old, often spiritual ideas about reality being more than just what we see day to day.
Which is a perfect transition, actually.
Yeah.
Let's talk about those ancient traditions.
Hmm.
They were seeking similar things, weren't they? Transformative visions.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about, getting high. There was often a deep ritual context. And a really common theme across cultures is this idea of death and rebirth.
Death and rebirth. How so?
Well, in initiation rites, shamanic journeys, there's often an ordeal, a symbolic death. Mircea Eliade, a historian of religion, wrote a lot about this. He talked about the shamanic vision of dismemberment.
Like being torn apart.
Yes. Horrifying, but symbolically crucial. Being torn apart by spirits, maybe boiled in a cauldron and then put back together, reborn as something new with new powers or knowledge. Siberian shaman accounts describe this vividly.
Okay, that sounds intense. But I can see the parallel with the psychedelic journey. You mentioned the psychedelic arc.
Exactly. There's the preparation, the buildup or ascent, then often a peak experience that can feel like ego dissolution or ego death.
The self kind of falling apart.
Right, which can be terrifying. But it's often followed by a sense of release, renewal, integration. That death-rebirth pattern is right there. Even in modern therapy, using psychedelics, confronting hard truths can feel like a symbolic death leading to growth.
Okay, so let's get specific. The Eleusinian mysteries. Ancient Greece. What was going on there?
Huge deal in the ancient world. People traveled from all over for this initiation. It was highly secret, but the goal was clearly transformation. There's that quote from Cicero.
What does he say?
Something like, initiates learn not just how to live life with more joy, but also to die with better hope.
Wow, that points to something profound.
Yeah.
And there was a special drink involved. Kaikion.
Yes, kaikion, a barley-based brew. And the big hypothesis, which is pretty compelling, is that it might have been psychoactive, potentially due to ergot fungus growing on the barley. Ergot contains alkaloids that are chemically very similar to LSD.
No way. Really?
Yeah. And there's even some archaeological evidence finding traces of ergot in pottery at Eleusis. It strongly suggests these ancient rites might have involved a psychedelic component.
So thousands of years ago, people were potentially having guided psychedelic sessions for spiritual transformation.
It looks quite possible. And think about that outcome, losing the fear of death. That's something often reported in modern mystical experiences triggered by psychedelics too. The parallels are striking.
And Eleusis wasn't the only one, right? The sources mention others.
Definitely not. You had soma in ancient India, a divine plant mentioned in the Vedas. Tionacatl, the flesh of the gods, mushrooms in Mesoamerica. Ololiuqui, the morning glory seeds used by the Aztecs.
So this use of psychoactive plants for visions was widespread.
Very widespread. And central to many shamanic traditions, too. Think ayahuasca in the Amazon used for healing and divination.
Psilocybin mushrooms with the Mazatec people in Mexico. Maria Sabina and her saint children.
Exactly. Even Amanita muscaria mushrooms in Siberia, possibly linked to shamanic flight experiences. The key is how these were culturally framed as journeys, as communication with spirits, not just drug effects.
Right. It wasn't recreational. It was sacred.
Deeply sacred. Yeah. And you didn't always need a substance. Think of the Native American vision quest.
Fasting, isolation.
Yeah.
Going out into nature alone.
Yeah, enduring hardship to seek a vision, often encountering a spirit animal, receiving guidance. That's another path to a similar kind of transformative experience.
So whether it's drugs or fasting or ritual, there's a pattern.
There seems to be. Preparation, an ordeal of some kind, the visionary experience itself, and then figuring out how to integrate it back into your life. That structure appears again and again. Table 1 in the document lays out these parallels really nicely.
Okay, this is fascinating.
Yeah.
So we have these powerful experiences, ancient and modern. Let's get into the how, the chemistry. How do these substances actually interact with our brains?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting from a biological perspective. The core insight is the structural similarity between many classic psychedelics, psilocybin, DMT, LSD, and our own brain chemicals.
Like serotonin?
Exactly like serotonin. And also melatonin, which regulates sleep, and even tryptophan, the amino acid that's the precursor for both serotonin and melatonin.
So they look alike on a molecular level.
They do. They all share a specific structure called an indole ring. They belong to this class called indole alkaloids. You can see it if you look at the diagrams, like in table 2 from the source. Tryptophan, serotonin, melatonin, DMT, psilocybin, LSD, they all have that core indole structure.
Okay, so they look similar. What does that mean for the brain?
It means they can interact with the brain's existing machinery. Specifically, they act primarily as agonists activators at serotonin receptors, particularly one called the 5-HT euroreceptor.
So they fit into the locks meant for serotonin.
Pretty much, yeah, like slightly different keys that can still turn the lock. Psilocin, which is what psilocybin becomes in the body, fits well. LSD fits too, and the source mentioned it has this extra bit, like a lid.
A lid?
Yeah, that apparently helps it clamp onto the receptor more tightly and for longer, which helps explain why an LSD trip lasts so much longer than, say, a DMT experience.
Ah, okay. Tiny molecular differences, huge experiential differences.
Precisely. It shows how sensitive the system is.
And melatonin, you mentioned that's related to, and DMT.
Chemically, yes. Melatonin and DMT are quite similar. This led to some early speculation, especially from Strassman, about their relationship, maybe during dreaming or other states. He actually studied melatonin before he got into the DMT research.
Is DMT made in our brains? I've heard that. From the pineal gland.
That's the theory, and it's quite controversial. The idea that the pineal gland produces significant DMT in humans. Well, the evidence is still debated. The document mentioned the study finding it in the pineal gland of rodents, which is suggestive, but human evidence is less clear.
So jury's still out on the pineal gland thing.
Pretty much. But the main point holds. These psychedelic molecules are chemically familiar to our brains. That's why they can have such profound effects. They're tapping into fundamental neurochemical pathways.
Okay, pathways involving serotonin. But then, you mentioned quantum consciousness earlier. That sounds like a whole different level.
It is. We're shifting from established neuroscience into more theoretical territory here, but it connects back, potentially, to that same indole ring structure in tryptophan.
Tryptophan again. How?
Well, this indole ring doesn't just make tryptophan a building block for serotonin and melatonin. It also has some interesting quantum properties. And when you get lots of tryptophan molecules arranged together in biological structure.
Like proteins.
Exactly, like in proteins called tubulin, which make up microtubules inside our neurons.
Microtubules. Aren't they just like the cell's scaffolding?
That was the old view. But the or-to-or theory from Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff proposes something much more radical. That microtubules aren't just structural supports, they might be processing information using quantum mechanics, and that consciousness itself might emerge from these quantum computations happening inside neurons.
Whoa, okay. Quantum computations in microtubules. How would that even work?
The theory suggests that the many tryptophan residues within the tubulin proteins create special zones, these hydrophobic pockets, where quantum states, like coherence, could be shielded and maintained for long enough to perform computations.
Coherence, like things acting in a coordinated quantum wave.
Sort of, yeah. And there's actually some recent research mentioned in that video transcript source that seems to support parts of this.
Like what?
Well, a 2023 simulation study showed that energy could travel along chains of tryptophan in microtubules in a quantum way, and even suggested quantum entanglement could be transferred between them.
Entanglement, like linked quantum states.
Yes. Suggesting these tryptophan chains could function as quantum information channels. It's pretty mind-blowing stuff.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Any other evidence?
There was also that study using lasers to excite tubulin. They observed some quantum-like optical effects things called superradiance and delayed luminescence.
Okay.
And interestingly, when they added anesthetics, drugs that switch consciousness off these quantum-like effects were dampened.
So, anesthetics might work by disrupting quantum processes in microtubules.
That's the implication, or at least one possibility raised by Hameroff and others. It connects the loss of consciousness under anesthesia to a potential quantum mechanism.
But Orshore is controversial.
Highly controversial, yes.
Right.
The main argument against it has always been decoherence, the idea that any quantum states in the warm, wet brain would collapse almost instantly, far too quickly for computation.
But these new findings challenge that.
They seem to suggest that maybe within the specific environment of the microtubule, quantum effects could persist longer than previously thought. It's still very much debated, but the evidence is growing. And we know quantum effects are real in other biological systems.
Like photosynthesis, bird navigation.
Exactly. So it's not completely outlandish to think they might play a role in the brain, too.
Okay, hang on. How does this connect back to psychedelics, besides tryptophan?
Well, the speculation, and it is speculation at this point, is that if microtubules are involved in quantum computation underlying consciousness, maybe psychedelic molecules like DMT or psilocin, which
Hmm.
also have that indole ring.
Maybe they interact with these quantum processes.
Possibly. Perhaps they alter the quantum computations in microtubules, leading to the profound shifts in consciousness we see. We don't have direct evidence for that interaction yet, but it's an intriguing hypothesis.
Especially since DMT is found naturally in the brain.
Right. Even if the pineal gland theory is uncertain, the presence of endogenous DMT raises questions. Could it play a role in normal consciousness, or perhaps in naturally occurring visionary states by modulating these putative quantum effects? It's fringe, but fascinating.
It is. It's kind of poetic, isn't it? Tryptophan being the source for serotonin, our mood regulator, and melatonin, our sleep timer, and these powerful psychedelics, and potentially being key to quantum effects in our neurons.
It really suggests a deep interconnectedness, doesn't it? From molecules to mind, maybe even involving the quantum realm, a very holistic perspective.
Okay. Mind officially blown. Let's try to bring it back a bit. We've talked chemistry, physics. Let's go back to the big picture idea. Perceiving more,
Yeah.
this mind at large concept.
Right. Aldous Huxley's idea that our brain normally acts as a reducing valve, filtering out a ton of reality to help us survive and function efficiently.
Because otherwise we'd be overwhelmed.
Probably. Huxley speculated that psychedelics temporarily bypass or open up this valve, letting in more of reality, what he called mind at large.
And his own mescaline experience seemed to confirm that for him, right? Seeing the isness of things.
Exactly. Ordinary objects became luminous, infinitely significant. Not just distorted, but somehow more real. It wasn't about hallucinating things that weren't there, but seeing what was there with the filters removed.
Does modern neuroscience back this up at all, the filter idea?
In a way, yes. We talked about the default mode network, DMN, right? The brain network involved in self-referential thought, our sense of being a separate ego.
Yeah, psychedelics reduce activity there.
Right. And at the same time, you often see increased communication across the whole brain. Regions that don't normally talk much suddenly connect. It's like the usual top-down control systems are relaxed.
Less filtering, more global integration. The orchestra improvising.
That's a great analogy. And it fits with theories like predictive processing.
How so?
Predictive processing suggests our brain constantly generates models or predictions about the world, and mostly just processes the errors, the difference between prediction and reality. Psychedelics might weaken the strength of these predictions, these filters.
Making us notice more. Lowering the threshold for what gets through.
Precisely. Letting in more raw sensory data, more unexpected connections. Robin Carhart Harris calls this the entropic brain, higher entropy, more randomness, a less ordered but potentially broader state of consciousness.
It's interesting how this modern neuroscience seems to echo what many cultures have believed for ages.
It really is. Shamans talking about seeing the spirit world, perceiving the underlying causes of illness. It's often framed as seeing a reality behind or beyond ordinary reality, accessing a different frequency, to use that antenna analogy again.
Cable 3 in the document compared normal and psychedelic states on things like perceptual bandwidth.
Yeah, it contrasts things like narrow versus broad bandwidth, segregated versus integrated brain networks, automatic meaning making versus questioning meaning, rigid beliefs versus belief relaxation. It really maps out the shifts.
That the big question remains.
Yeah.
Is it really seeing more reality or just the brain generating novel patterns? When someone sees an aura, is that energy or just a visual artifact?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And probably unanswerable definitively right now. The filter hypothesis doesn't necessarily claim everything perceived as veridical external reality. There are clearly distortions, hallucinations.
So noise and signal.
Potentially, the idea is that by reducing the filtering, you might let in both more noise and potentially some valid signals or insights that are normally excluded. And we do see brainwave changes like reduced alpha, increased gamma, that might correlate with increased information processing.
It definitely opens up philosophical rabbit holes. Non-materialist ideas. Accessing information beyond the physical brain.
Absolutely. Transpersonal psychology gets very interested here, especially with the entity encounters and the sense of receiving external knowledge or wisdom. It challenges purely brain-based models of consciousness.
Though, again, we have to be cautious about assuming it's all real.
Crucially important. Skepticism is vital. But the subjective feeling of profundity, of revealed truth, is undeniable for many people. And the idea that our normal consciousness is filtered seems quite plausible, both subjectively and based on some neuroscience. Huxley's framework is still pretty compelling.
So, wrapping this all up, quite a journey we've taken.
Indeed. From the raw subjective feelings of these altered states
Through the ancient rituals seeking similar transformations.
down to the molecular mimicry enabling these effects.
And even touching on these wild quantum possibilities in the brain.
The parallels between the psychedelic path and the ancient visionary path are just remarkable. It points to something fundamental about the human desire, or perhaps capacity, for expanded consciousness.
And understanding the biochemistry, how these molecules fit into our serotonin system, gives it a real grounding.
But then the quantum research just blows the doors open again, suggesting maybe there are deeper layers to how consciousness operates that we're only just beginning to probe.
Ultimately, that filter hypothesis, Huxley's reducing valve, seems like a useful thread connecting it all. The idea that we might be temporarily perceiving more, whether that's more of the external world or more of our own internal landscape.
And the importance of context, of cultural and spiritual frameworks for making sense of these often overwhelming experiences really stands out too. It's not just about the drug, it's about the set and setting and the integration.
It really leaves you wondering about the full potential of our own nervous system, doesn't it? What it's truly capable of interfacing with.
Absolutely. Perhaps psychedelics and maybe even those ancient practices are like tools that temporarily recalibrate our antennas, revealing glimpses of a reality far more interconnected and mysterious than we usually perceive.
Makes you think, what frequency bands are we tuned into right now?
Mm.
And what might we be missing?
A question worth pondering, definitely.